listening to the Life Edit Project podcast, where busy, ambitious high achievers get the tools they need to fight overwhelm and overthinking with balance, self-mastery, and a positive mindset. I'm your host, Elizabeth Burrows. I'm serving up bite-sized truth bombs in a judgment-free zone based on my perspective as a life coach, wife, mom, and recovering overachiever. We keep it real over here, which usually means some combination of insightful, entertaining, and a hot mess express. So, if you're looking for perfection, look elsewhere. But if you're still with me, let's dig into this week's episode. Good day, good people. I am so excited to finally be getting this podcast out into the world. It has been a dream in my heart and an idea in my head for just so long. And now it kind of feels surreal for it to be a real thing that other people can listen to now. But here we are. And I have so many juicy conversations planned for you on this podcast. But before digging into all the great topics and all the fancy tips, I first want to just ground everything and give this podcast a bit of a foundation. So I'm thinking of this as episode 0 because it's the starting point. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into the kinds of topics that we'll be discussing so that you know what to expect, because I do want you to come back and I want you to keep listening. First things first, an introduction. My name is Elizabeth Burrows, and I am currently a full-time life coach. But I did not start out that way, like not at all. Had a whole different career before this in economic development, which has absolutely nothing to do with life coaching. So I worked at several different public agencies and nonprofit organizations here in South Florida, where I live. I was born and raised here in South Florida. And I worked in economic development for about 18 years altogether. And I left that career to pursue coaching full time and started full time in my business in 2022. So it was not a logical career move that I made. I basically fell into life coaching. It started in 2018 after going through a difficult period in my own life and finding my way out of it because of coaching. And I'm sure I'll talk more about my personal story and my personal transformation in future episodes, but here's what you need to know about me right now. I am a recovering overachiever and a recovering perfectionist. And I say that I'm recovering because while I'm not the overachiever and perfectionist that I used to be, I know that when I'm not using the tools that I've gained and learned from coaching, my brain will absolutely revert to old habits, and I can easily fall back into those patterns of trying to overachieve and trying to make everything perfect. So here's how this all started. As a kid, I was smart and well-behaved. I was well-mannered and responsible. I was basically a really low-maintenance kid that didn't make trouble, and I made life easy for the adults around me. And I was the kind of kid, because of that, I was the kind of kid that got lots of praise from adults, right? They were always just telling me that they thought the world of me. And that was from all kinds of adults around me, to some extent, my family, but definitely teachers and the adults in the places that I went, right? They all gave me this positive feedback. And that, my friends, was the recipe for me becoming an overachiever. Not because I felt like I needed to achieve things in order to earn love, but it was more because my identity got wrapped up in being the good girl that did exceptionally well at everything. Because it wasn't just that I was smart, it was that so much of the things that adults tell you need to do as a kid came easily to me without me trying very hard. So I didn't just get good grades, I got straight A's, and I graduated valedictorian of my 8th grade class. And I wasn't just a good student in high school, I managed to graduate in the top 2% of my high school class. And I completed a very challenging demanding magnet program while doing a bunch of extracurricular activities. And I didn't just go to college. I earned a 4-year degree in 3 years on a full academic scholarship. And then I went to grad school on a full, all expense paid private scholarship that you couldn't apply for. You just had to be invited to, right? And then I landed my first job out of grad school on the very first interview. And at the time, that organization that hired me, I was the youngest person they had ever hired, right? So like I was just stacking achievement on top of achievement. And this didn't just like extend into like school and work. Some of this showed up in my personal life as well. So now I wasn't always winning in the relationship department, and I'm sure I'll talk more about that in future episodes. But once I found my husband, we went from our first platonic hangout to being married and homeowners in less than 2 years. And when we decided to start a family, I didn't just have a baby. I literally, carried my baby with a fabulous, healthy pregnancy, and I worked up until the day I went into labor, and then I delivered my daughter naturally with no medication, right? Now, I'm not telling you all of this because I'm trying to brag, and I'm not fishing for compliments. I don't need you to be impressed by this resume, right? That's not what this is. I just want to paint a picture of how much overachieving I have racked up in my life, even before I became an adult. So that by the time that I got to college, I literally had no idea how to face or process failure or even mediocrity. For me, overachieving wasn't just an event, it was how I did life. But of course, the older we get, the more complex life gets, and the more life throws at us circumstances in which we will not naturally excel, right? So much of that kid stuff just came easy to me, but the adult stuff, not so much. But when you're a chronic overachiever and life starts throwing at you things that are not easy to achieve, this can cue your perfectionism. And hear me when I say this. Perfectionism is overachieving's personal assistant. Somebody tweet that. That's a good one. Being a perfectionist is often how overachievers protect their identity and their position of being the best. Perfectionism is how overachievers cope with tasks and challenges and uncertainties that threaten their likelihood of success. So you either work harder to be better or you avoid the hard thing completely. You don't move until the plan is perfect and you have perfect conditions, because anything less than perfect or less than the best is unacceptable. And the irony, of course, is that while we tell ourselves that being a perfectionist means operating at a really high level, what it actually means in real life is a lot of missed opportunities and just unfulfilled potential. For me, my perfectionism often showed up as over-planning, overanalyzing, and indecision. I needed to have all the details, and I needed to think of all the different permutations of how things could go, and I needed to anticipate all the different challenges or things that could go wrong so that I could solve for it all in advance. And if I couldn't do that, if I didn't have all the information, if I didn't have all the plans, I couldn't move forward. And so for me, that just meant a lot of things just didn't get done. I have personally made so many mistakes and missteps because of my perfectionist tendencies. In fact, I will admit, I caught myself on the verge of getting stuck in a perfectionist loop trying to get this podcast out into the world. Like literally, this is my first attempt ever in life at creating a brand new podcast. So I had no idea what I was doing when I came up with the idea to start a podcast. But I did know that there are a crap ton of resources out there on the interwebs that make podcasting easy. And I trusted myself to find them, to learn how to use them and make this podcast a real thing. And so my plan, my intention was to create a simple podcast that allows me to get my voice and my coaching concepts out into the world in this accessible audio format. That was the plan. So I started with this really simple plan to make this really simple podcast, and I just started plugging away at it. However, my brain fell into that old familiar habit of wanting and trying to overachieve. And so the more I started plugging away at my little plan, the more I learned about podcasts. And the more I learned, the more I realized was possible. And then the more I wanted to do, the bigger and bolder and more grand my vision for this podcast became. But of course, I still didn't know what I was doing because I've never done this before, y'all. So I started doing my favorite thing ever, both as just a nerd and as a recovering perfectionist. I started researching. I researched the crap out of podcasts. And before I knew it, I had fallen into like several black holes of information on the interwebs about all the different things about podcasting. Podcast hosting, editing, launch strategy, sound equipment, formats, SEO, marketing, you name it. I looked it up and I went deep. And I mean deep on all this information, and I obsessed about all the podcast things for about 2 days. It took me 2 days to realize that my brain was trying to make me an expert podcaster that like would release episode 1 and make it onto the new and noteworthy Apple Podcast list, right? Within my first month of publishing my very first episode. But just because that's how my brain wanted to approach podcasting didn't mean that that's what I actually wanted to do. What I really wanted to do was follow my simple plan to get my simple little podcast out into the world and then figure out the rest later. So once I recognized what was happening, I was able to get myself back on track and coach myself and get coached. And here we are. I'm in your earbuds. Fabulous. But I tell you all of this because I want you to know that I know what it feels like to be an overachiever and a perfectionist. And I also know what it costs to live that way. And I know that it's possible to do life differently, even if overachieving and perfectionism is the only way you know how to live right now. So on this podcast, I'm going to be talking about all the different kinds of problems that people like us have as overachievers and perfectionists. I will talk about all the sneaky ways it shows up and how it impacts us in all these different areas of life. And I'll be sharing insights and techniques that you can use to disrupt these patterns. And of course, I'll be bringing my perspective as a life coach, my perspective as a wife, mom, a professional, a Black woman, and any other role that feels relevant to the conversation and to the episode. My desire is that this podcast will be a resource for you to help you create balance in any area of your life that needs it, and to make the journey a little easier and a little less lonely for you. I'll be publishing new episodes every week, and I'm going to work to keep the episodes to 30 minutes or less so that the information is easy to digest in the midst of your already very busy life. I'm going to be doing these episodes on my own for the most part, but I do have a couple of special guests lined up later here in season 1. And I'm not going to spoil the surprise right now, so you'll just have to stay tuned to learn who else you'll get to hear from. But I promise it'll be juicy and probably very entertaining. Like, seriously, it's going to be hilarious. I will say this, though. I'm coming in hot for episode 1, season 1, tackling one of my favorite topics to talk about as a life coach. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because, again, I don't want to spoil the surprise, but it is a topic that I have talked about before, and I've written some blog posts about it before. But I'm bringing some new, fresh insights and some never before discussed perspective to this conversation in episode 1. So you definitely want to tune in. So please make sure that you are following or subscribed to the Life Edit Project podcast. And make sure you turn on notifications. That way you always have the latest episode at your fingertips on your device of choice. We are, I'm so proud to say, streaming on all the major platforms. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, etc. So you can find the show wherever you like to listen. For now, that's episode 0 in the books. or in the cloud or whatever the appropriate turn or phrase is for podcasts. So thanks for listening. I'll be back in your ears next week with a full, juicy episode. Peace. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Life Edit Project podcast. I'd love to hear what your favorite moment or key takeaway was from this conversation. You can send me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter to let me know. My handle is @LifeEditProject, all one word, in all the places. My social media is linked up in the show notes to make it easy for you. Holla at your girl. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, don't just stay busy with the life you have, get busy creating the life you want.